We have been talking for some time now about these cornerstones of collaboration, the pathway, the skill set, the mindset. Last two webinars, we touched on the two at the bottom there. Today, we want to talk about mindset, which in our experience increasingly seems to be the most important key to successful collaboration. So we'll just dive straight on in. Those of you of my vintage will remember Tina Turner. What's love got to do with it, wasn't it? So you may be asking, what's mindset got to do with it? And so let me recount a bit of a story. I mean, this just happens over and over again. Some years ago, I was working with a council client. He was senior person in a council that had for many years been felt besieged by a particular activist community group with a couple of particular voices. And the general manager had been there for decades, 23 years or something. And over time, by the time I got in there, I could see that he was feeling beaten down, worn down, and it was completely defensive. The council had drawn up the drawbridge and was hiding behind the moat, and we couldn't possibly go and talk to that particular group, those stakeholders. So I was talking to my client, Peter, about this. We had this difficult problem that was on their plate, a planning issue. And I was talking to Peter, well, he was talking about this group and the grief they were giving him. Have you been and talked to them, Peter? Oh, I couldn't do that. Those people have horns and a pointy tail. So we discussed that a bit, and to his credit, he agreed to go and meet this particular guy, public enemy number one. And so I called him a couple of days later. How'd you go, Peter? And he said, well, it turns out we had a pretty good conversation. Turns out that we both grew up in Melbourne and in the same sort of region. And in fact, this guy was coached by my dad in the footy. And all of a sudden there was a connection, and Peter was seeing this guy differently, and everything that happened thereafter everything was changed. This guy was brought into the process, and it didn't mean that Peter agreed with him, although they agreed with each other. He was still a critic, but the fact that Peter could engage with him, because he just couldn't go back. He could no longer see that person or the situation the same way. Something had shifted. Nothing had changed, but everything had changed. And the only thing really that had shifted was what's going on in his head. So these situations are ubiquitous, universal. We all have them. And I'm going to break the golden rule of webinars now and give you 30 seconds of dead silence, because I would like you to think of a situation where you have changed. What's changed? A situation when you really can't see things the same way. Something's happened, you've realized, you've learnt, something's taken place, and you can't see things the same way. So I'm going to start now, and when you think you've got something, just click the little raise your hand icon, only so we can get a sense of our timing. So 30 seconds, 45 seconds, when have you seen a situation change?
Where's the little hand icon?
It's in reactions, Mike.
Reactions. I don't know where that is.
Control panel. Well, don't worry so much about the hand. Think about the story.
Yeah, well, we can see you. Just put your hand up.
Is that good enough? Yeah, I would say I've certainly had that. I was working in the Middle East, and I realized Arab people that I'm working with didn't think like Westerners, and it was a huge revelation. They had a different mindset, and probably the biggest thing is that religion was part of life. That if you didn't have a religion, there was a problem. And so I had to change my whole the way I spoke to their counterparts, because religion was at the forefront of things, and contractual matters were mentioned at the very end of conversations. They were more interested in forming a relationship than talking about the actual work. And so I changed my whole way of dealing with business. I went to every religious event, and I went out to coffee all the time. And business was just a little bit at the end.
Yeah. So, Mike, that's about you making realizations about their mindset. Did you recognize your own?
I had to change because I was approaching from a Western point of view. We just had to talk about business, and it was purely business, and everything became all about the social aspect. Business was just happened to be a thing at the end.
Interesting.
So I guess you could never see the situations you're approaching quite the same again after that, after you made that realization.
Yeah, definitely. I can see it everywhere now, and I want diversity in teams because often I'll have a blind spot that I can't see what other people are thinking because I'm a certain demographic and I need other people to show me there's different ways of thinking.
Anyone else willing to share a similar story? Then we'll move on. And if you feel like diving in, don't forget to unmute.
So I had one, Stuart, and I put my hand up. I guess it was a realization I made a long time ago, and it was the difference between what I call engineer or pretengineer. So I was an engineer. I was trained as a metallurgist, a materials engineer, and I always thought that it was about structure. It was important that I structured everything. I knew where I was going. I was organised. And after a few years, I did the MBTI, which is just a process for understanding how you think. And I sort of realised after doing that I wasn't actually a structured engineer. I was what I call a pretengineer. You know, I sort of made up I was one, but really, I could never look at it again because I realised I was actually flexible and open, and I wasn't structured, but I'd actually trained myself, I guess, thinking that I needed to be who I wasn't. So it was the realization I could never look at a situation again now with the same discipline that I used to. I'd go, oh, that's okay. I don't need to worry about that. So it freed me up, I guess, from thinking a certain way because I just made a realization that actually I was inherently a little different to what I thought.
Yeah, good. So the point is that you changed, that it is possible, and I guess we all have these experiences. And I just wanted to have that little exchange of stories, just to sort of bring to the front our realization again that what goes on in the mind is capable of change. So just moving on from that. I don't want to give the impression that this mindset change we're talking about requires an epiphany, what our colleague Max used to call a blinding flash of the obvious, a BFO. It's not about the road to the Damascus, struck by lightning and, oh, wow, I see the world differently. And it's neither is it about if we get in a good process or a good facilitator, or if we design a really good collaborative process, we will have a different experience and think about each other differently. I mean, that's partly true, but that's not what this is about. The point I'm trying to make here is that the key to successful collaboration is about what's going on between the ears, how I see myself, how I see others. And the good news is that I have some control over that. And I think that's the practice that we want to talk about.
I think of it simply just in terms of the assumptions we have about ourselves and others, how we act and react and how we see others, because we act in those ways. And I think the experiences I've had is that when you see it differently, you never act quite the same way. And so you have some choices to act differently by thinking differently. I think that's my experience.
Yeah. And I just wanted to share a direct quote from a client. This client was in local government, and they'd had some of these experiences working with people, and the realization really that I need to bring a new personality to this. I need to be a different person. I can't do this. I can't be the same person that I have always been in my interactions with my collaborators if I'm going to make this work.
I think a bit like Mike's story there about, you had to bring a new way of working, a new way of thinking into that, working with the groups in that country.
Yeah.
And yet the evidence shows that despite that realization, it is so easy to get sucked back into the black hole of our thinking, our business as usual thinking. In fact, it's really hard to escape that. So a critical piece here is about keeping in mind, how am I thinking in my collaboration? It's a really fundamental element. Is my mindset, am I being a collaborator? So one way to talk about this that I have found useful for myself is thinking about the difference between looking at collaboration through the mirror, through the window, and looking at collaboration in the mirror. So too often I hear clients saying, if only they would do something different, or if only I could get them to do something. Now, just this morning, I had an hour-long coaching conversation with a client, internal team, strategic planning team, and he needs and wants them to take ownership and get their fingers on the strategic planning. And he's having these regular meetings, and he was reflecting on his last meeting 2 weeks ago. And the questions he's asking are, how do I get them to step up and take ownership? How do I get them to be accountable? My collaborators, what can I do to manage them so that they take this on collaboratively? Sorry about that. And I guess my questions were about, so how are you approaching it and how are you thinking about it? And, it wasn't long before he's realizing that, well, actually, I'm walking in there with a focus on getting an answer, and rather than opening up the conversation. And so really, all I did was hold up the mirror. We stopped looking at the window, through the window at those collaborators and aren't they a problem? It's much more about, what's my thinking? How am I seeing this situation? And, what can I do differently?
I was always reminded of a story once, Stuart, when somebody said to me, when you're pointing at the problem, like, it's them who are the problem, they pointed out to me that when I do that, 3 of my fingers are pointing backwards at who and 1 at them. I'm always reminded by that, saying, who's the problem here? Maybe the mirror is more important than the window.
Yeah. So my client's gone into the next meeting this afternoon with questions about how did you feel, less about the content and more about explorations of relationships. So what does that look like in practice? I've got a couple of things to talk through, then John's got a little story to share. That's where we're going today. So collaboration through the window in blue, collaboration in the mirror in pink here. And I heard this from my client this morning. It's his project, so he's kind of taking that I'm in charge of this, I'm responsible mindset into a collaborative conversation. And I could actually hear him thinking, I could virtually hear him thinking, how do I manage them? How do I make sure they get the right information out of this? How do I get them to have the conversation I want them to have? That's really the subtext. And the conversation with him was about, well, why don't you go in and talk about how you were a little frustrated leaving that last meeting 2 weeks ago. So this was a vulnerability piece, and he had to. It's scary to be vulnerable, so he had to step in and. He's planning to say, well, I found that last one challenging and I left feeling frustrated because, and how did you feel about that? And just open up a completely different conversation. But the hard thing, the thinking that has to change is, can I be vulnerable? Am I willing to go in and, reveal my discomfort and my experience of that? So likewise, the expert, am I the person with all the knowledge and wisdom in this space? If I am, it's pretty hard to collaborate if you're the person with the answers, and it's all about how do I educate them? How can I protect them from bad information, wrong information? How can I make sure they have the right and useful conversation? I could hear my client this morning asking those questions. How do I manage them? I'm the person with the knowledge. And collaboration requires the shift, doesn't it, to I need your help. I don't know the answer. And again, that's the conversation we had this morning. How am I going to go into that group and say, I need your help? That's the thinking shift.
And I wouldn't underestimate the one, we're all experts, and it's rather challenging to actually move away from being the expert, and that question of asking for help, often quite challenging for people who have been brought up, trained to know the answer. So it highlights for me just how it's hard work to actually just move it, but it actually opens up some opportunities for you to be able to do it differently if you can make that leap.
Yeah. And that hard work's the black hole, isn't it? It's hard to leave that.
Hard to leave.
Yeah. So let's just have a look at one more of these. Slightly different table, but the same idea. When collaborating, I feel vulnerable because, so that drives behaviors which result in these outcomes. But in pink, I should be thinking like this, or I could be thinking like this. So we'll just pick out that first row so it's not too overwhelming. And again, I could hear my client absolutely in this space of vulnerability this morning. They probably left last week's meeting feeling like it was a waste of time. And so he's feeling like, wow, how am I going to not waste their time? I could hear the questions he was proposing to ask all about answers, solutions, how will we get to the end? And you could just hear that fear driving a behavior, rushing, failure to learn together, all about answering rather than asking. That was just absolutely crystal clear. And so again, after our conversation, he's changing how he's thinking about that and being open about that fear, talking to people about that fear, putting the fear on the table and inviting a conversation about what's the most useful thing we can do today? What's the useful conversation? How did you experience last week's meeting? So it's a small thing, but it's a huge thing, because business as usual has us driving, rushing, reaching for the answer. But collaboration requires us to be vulnerable, to go slow, to go fast, to have difficult conversations. And that's the black hole, because that's quite hard to do. So in practice...
just the next slide, Stuart, and I'll talk. So I had a really good example just recently, and it was in a conversation, catching conversation with a client who were concerned about, in this case, hidden agendas. So they had a meeting that they'd been meeting with a bunch of people, some, so you might say, somewhat difficult people. And so that was a bit of a challenge for them. And they were concerned about the hidden agendas, what they were calling hidden agendas. And they thought they were compromising the collaboration often. They wanted a tool to stop such behaviour. So we actually said, okay, well, there's a tool here. Next one, Stuart. Which we call hold positions aside. Now, it's a pretty simple tool where if you're anticipating people to be focused on their own view and not listen to others, a process whereby you just ask people to identify what it is that matters to them, put up on the wall so it's sort of visible, either face down or face up, and that seems to provide them an ability to just move past it. Okay, my position's up there, the thing that matters to me, but I can have a conversation and listen to others. So we're exploring this as a tool, and it was interesting because the client, both the people in the room said, John, I'm realizing that it's my thinking about hidden agendas that's also a problem. It's not just that I need a tool, but I'm thinking that people shouldn't have these agendas, that keeping things hidden was bad and that they couldn't be trusted. So I don't trust them, and so they'll probably undermine me, therefore I don't trust them. And so it would turn into a bit of a spiral of that BOU black hole. And as we talked it through, they said, I could actually see it as that people have agendas, have hats, support their constituents, and they hold on to these because they really matter to them. And if I think that what's important in that case is to respect that their position or their interests and values that might sit underneath that position, because it's what energizes them. And I really need to bring that energy and diversity into the discussion. So I shouldn't fear these agendas, but I should embrace them and not think of the hidden agendas, but just agendas that we can actually do something with. And it was interesting because they sort of went away and were able to change the nature of the conversation just by acting a little differently. And I suspect now they can never look at the situation and think hidden agendas the same way again, because they've just sort of lifted their head over the parapet and seen something a bit different.
Yeah. Yeah. If we're thinking about those as hidden agendas, then how could we trust you? You know, you're not revealing what you really feel. If I'm thinking about those as things that matter to you, well, that reframes it. You know, that's a constructive way to say, well, let's talk about what matters to us. It's not about hiding or controlling. So
it was quite interesting for me because it was interesting too for me because it just emerged out of a conversation about using a particular tool. It wasn't about let's change your mindset. You know, it was just realizations happen in a whole lot of different ways, and you never quite know when it will happen, but it's often clues in how you're talking about what's going on. Will give you clues as to your mindset and perhaps some potential if you reflect on it, if you can look in the mirror to say, maybe how could I see this situation a bit differently that might be more useful? And again, it's rather challenging if you don't trust them and you think they're hidden agendas. It's a bit of a break to go and say, okay, no, I can really trust them. So again, there's lots of drag back to that black hole in trying to actually change your thinking.
Yeah, that's good. All right, thanks. So I guess just to wrap that up, it also highlights the importance of the thinking change. Remember, we're talking in the context of cornerstones here: skill set, pathway, and mindset. The tool is one of the skills you might use, the tools and skills, but unless and until your thinking changes, the tool can't really change the game in and of itself. It's the thinking, the way in which you are thinking about how you are using the tool that matters. And ultimately, you don't need the tool at all. It's the thinking that's important. The tool is just a device. You know.
And I think it does highlight that the tool on its own is just useless. I mean, if you still think that you don't trust them, it doesn't matter how well this tool works, you still won't trust them. So it needs to be something about your thinking as well as the other pieces that make sense.
Yeah, so the magic happens between the ears, not in some smart theory. Yeah. So what we're really talking about there, hidden agendas, is this framework. Some of you no doubt will have seen this before. I think we have shared it before. Two people with two different positions, position A and position B, and your hidden agenda is probably up there in, somewhere in that triangle. And you'll be telling me what your soapbox view of the world. I think we should lock down because this virus is killing us, or I think we have to keep the economy open, position A. And while ever we're talking at that level, up at the top at our positions, all we've got between us is space, is polarization, is difference, left wing, right wing, your position is wrong, my position is right. So the tool and the thinking is about exploring below those positions. I have to be thinking, what's going on? What has informed that position? What sits below that person? What's important to us mutually? And that can be really hard if I'm collaborating with the enemy and I really strongly disagree with them. My natural reaction would be to defend, rationalize, argue, convince. My thinking has to change so that I can get down to that solution-focused conversation. But again, it all happens in here. And until that changes, there's little I can do with this. So I'm just conscious of the time. We might move on. Anything you wanted to add to that, John, at all?
No.
Okay. So sort of wrapping up here, what's mindset got to do with it? Well, again, going back to these cornerstones, to collaborate effectively, to be an effective collaborator, we need to know what to do and how to do it. They're our skills, our tools. We need to know where we are in the pathway. You know, we need to have some sense of the how. But most importantly, we need to be, it's how we are thinking as we do that that makes all the difference. If I'm thinking like a collaborator, I can act like a collaborator. If I'm not thinking like a collaborator, it's pretty hard to do that. And the black hole, you know, sucks me back into business as usual. Oh, if only they would collaborate more effectively. If only they were more collaborative. So the thinking is really important. Which leads us to the question, what does that look like? How do you build that thinking? Well, as John's alluded to, there's all sorts of micro and macro ways in the moment and more strategically. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's a constant, you've got to keep that mirror in your pocket all the time and pull it out often and be checking your own thinking, our own thinking, one's own thinking. And you can use the tools, as John's just shared that story, that the tool can be a vehicle. What's this tool? What's my thinking about this tool telling me about my mindset? Am I approaching use of this tool like a collaborator or as a control perspective? It's really helpful in organizations to do this with peers. It's pretty hard to avoid the black hole if you're the only one trying to shift up here. If everything else culturally, in terms of structure and process, is about business as usual thinking. So finding a way to get your peers into a space where you can have this conversation and look in the mirror together, hold it up for each other, can be immensely freeing up, because as some of you see some nods there, it's pretty challenging to do it on your own. And a mechanism, some way, a process and structure. It's not enough just to say we'd like to do that. We need to build in a way to do that, which is, again, how I ended up having that conversation with my client this morning. Every month, we get on the phone on Zoom for an hour and we reflect on this, because it's so invisible. And unless we're reflecting, nothing changes.
I think the point about the mirror, look in the mirror, it's that time for reflection, which we often struggle to find. We constantly find people value just taking the time out to think about how they're thinking about it. I wouldn't underestimate scheduling your time to think about how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Happy to take any questions and comments. We can stick around for a bit. As usual, we've got the next webinar coming up on the 15th, and that's another free half hour at lunchtime on the 15th, Thursday. The other thing I just wanted to point out again was we're about to launch our first ever 6-week program, a deeper dive. It'll be a small group. It'll be practice, go away, apply some tools on your job, come back, reflect next week. We'll have small group, large group thing. We're pretty excited about that, and love you to put your hands up and get involved. So more information about that later. Thanks, and by all means sign off if you need to, but by all means stick around. Any questions, comments, thoughts, anything you want to dive into a bit more? No.
Just with your saying you're learning with a cohort of peers, John, when we spoke the other day, we had a cohort and I was learning so much out of it.
Oh.
I was just interested in my peers' thoughts because I thought that was helping. But how would I do that without you in the room? What do I need to kind of make sure, what are we talking about to facilitate that kind of growth mindset, or the mindset of just looking at being collaborators? Because that's what we've got to do as a team. We do have to we all have to liaise with mana whenua, and we all have to change our mindset because it is different. But what are we going to do to start that kind of conversation?
Good, interesting question, Mike.
You could start it informally at any moment, couldn't you? You could go and ask your peers, how is it going? How what's your experience? How's it feeling? And be sort of coaching each other just formally or on an informal basis. That would be the low-hanging fruit. John?
Yeah, well, I think, Mike, your experience already of what you talked about before provide you a bit of a framework for having exactly that conversation. How are we thinking about this situation? You know, what's our mindset around working with mana whenua? What would it be like to be in their shoes? And interestingly, inviting mana whenua in to find a volunteer who's willing to actually help the group think about that.
Yeah.
That's a nice way to do it. I think you would find people, mana whenua, more than happy to say we'd love to help that thinking, because I think they recognise the challenge. So again, don't try and solve the problem on your own. Once you're aware it's there, invite others in to help you. And if it is about other people, how other people think, nothing like having other people in the room to help you with that thinking.
They would benefit from exactly the same thing, because everyone struggles with the thinking. So, you know,
and the other thing it does, it builds the relationship. And because, you know, just the very thing of asking for help, as we alluded to before, makes a huge difference. It's about respect. So you have huge spin-offs, I think, from inviting people into the dilemma you have. And if this is about how do I change my mindset, invite them into that dilemma.
All right. Yeah, I can see that.
Yes.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Any other comments or questions from anyone?
I've just got a reflection to share. When you talked about having that like sharing the vulnerability and having that humility to learn, I have been using my toddler in my work environment as an example to say, you know, like looking at him, it's interesting how inquisitive he is, and so I wonder, how do you do these things in here? I felt like that was a soft, safe spot, and it's probably different for every person, but I think safety and, you know, feeling you're not judged is a big component of these things. And obviously we provide our kids with safety, so I felt like the two creates that environment of using it as a tool or excuse to sort of share your vulnerability. It's just a reflection.
Yeah, good. And just it makes me think that toddlers are learning machines, aren't they? They're always sucking in information. And I guess that's the mindset that we need to be, or that we could be nice to tap into in any collaboration. If we're curious about how you see it, if we're curious about your perspective, your experience, if we're thinking like a toddler, that's not a bad model for how we might be approaching our stakeholders. But it's so easy to be thinking like the expert, isn't it? Or the person who's got a project manage this and get the outcomes.
Yeah, that's true. I think we often adopt the tantrum bit of toddlers and not necessarily the...
There's a few bits we'd like to leave behind. It actually does remind me of some work at BHP years ago, where a colleague was talking with one of the lady in the group, and she said, you know, I always struggle with this plant manager. He just pushes my buttons, how I see him. He's arrogant, and I just react. And so this person said, well, when do you find you are calm? You don't react. She says, oh, when I look at my child, you know, my little baby, I just transforms me. I said, okay, could you imagine as you sit down with this plant manager just to see him as that? And she said she went away and experimented. She completely changed the dynamic with that person, because she didn't react. She was in a different place, a safer, calmer place. So she acted differently. It wasn't what he didn't do anything different, but she just responded and acted differently, and that changed the dynamic, which I found quite interesting and just reflective of what we're talking about. Nice. So all what's going on up here, and it's not about the other person; it's about us.
Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? We can stick around.
Well, I have one that's a more directed. John, I was talking to you, one of the program manager for the police, and she was wanting to see if you'd be interested in talking to her. I was going to pass on your details.
Yeah.
So no, it's the New Zealand Police program for upgrades.
Yeah, sure.
They've got the same mana whenua co-design that we have.
Right.
Good.
Sure. Yep.
All right. Well, folks, unless there's anything else, we'll let you get back to your your lunch and to your days, and happy collaborating as usual. We've recorded this. I'll send out the link to that to this on YouTube. We might send a tool or two or something that we've looked at today as usual, and hope to see you on the 15th. And yeah, keep in mind the larger program if you're interested in going deeper. Thanks very much.
everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
And no hurrah.